Welcome.
All right. Steven, thank you for joining episode 2 of the New Now Talks with ViKA. We are coming at this in a really interesting space and time. We're 3 weeks into probably the greatest shift we've seen in the world, which is an appropriate time to bring you on. I've been reading your book, The Future is Faster Than We Think. And for those that aren't familiar, Steven is probably one of the most prolific writers of our generation. And I don't say that lightly. It's because he's written for maybe every publication under the sun, was a top journalist, award-winning writer. His last book, Stealing Fire, was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize, and he's written, I think, 8 New York Times bestsellers. So as someone who is a big fan of curiosity, you are one of the most curious humans on the planet. And your book came out, I think, mid-January. So it's really appropriate to talk about the convergence of exponential technologies, what's happening now, how you're relating to it all on a personal level, and then how we integrate the thing that you've been studying for 30 years, flow, so that we can actually regulate our nervous systems and thrive through this chaos instead of really becoming victim to it. So welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Wonderful. The first kind of question that I have for you is, what have the last 3 weeks taught you about yourself?
That's an interesting question. I'm not so sure they taught me anything new about myself. I learned a tremendous amount about the people I work with, and a tremendous amount about my company, and and those sorts of things. You have to understand that I live in the middle of nowhere. I live halfway up a mountain, and under normal circumstances, social isolation is my middle name.
Yeah.
At the end of March, I was coming off of, honest to God, a 7-year sprint that was literally taking me to the end of the March. And I was coming home for 5-6 weeks to work on my new novel, which is a follow-up. The book I wrote after Stealing Fire is called Last Tango in Cyberspace, the novel. And so I'm doing a sequel to that. So I was coming home to do that and ski. And so they shut the resorts down, but I can go into the backcountry. And so like my life, it doesn't look a whole lot different. And I get as fucked up as everybody else. You know what I mean? Like my wife and I were talking about it the other day, and, we were arguing, and we don't normally argue. And, our conclusion was, yeah, you know what? We're crazy, just like everybody else is crazy. Like there are days that the stress just gets to you, right? It's just hard, and you're going to crack. And the best of us who have all the tools are going to crack sometimes still, right? That's without saying. So I don't necessarily know if I learned a lot about that. What I like, my team and the people I work with blew my mind at how kind of adaptable and flexible and strong and wonderful, and so much amazing even research and science has kind of come out of this, both for our organization, a lot of other organizations at this point, and it was amazing to see how fast we could move. Those are things that I saw, and and I talked to a lot of people I haven't talked to in 20 years, and that was sweet. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I think this is helping us connect in ways that social media pulled us apart. We thought that social media would bring us together, and it did initially. The telephone and email before that, and then it pulled us apart. And so I think what's happening is we're going back to the way things used to be, but in modern times. And so I'm curious, when you're talking to your friends, are you FaceTiming them, or are you just?
If I can avoid it, no. I like the telephone. I
Yeah.
don't like seeing the people I'm talking to. It's just, I think you get a deeper level of intimacy, and mostly I can't stand, if I could just look at you and get rid of me on this, I'd be psyched. I can't stand having to look at myself while I have a conversation with somebody.
Yeah, I totally hear that. I want to pick up on something that you said about you and your wife. You guys have been together for a really long time, and so I'm sure you've seen yourselves through lots of different phases of evolution. So when you're catching yourself being stressed and nitpicking, is there an awareness that you mutually come together, or does one person just say, "Hey, this is ridiculous. This isn't us"?
It depends on what we're fighting about. Like, you know what I mean? Under not in this case, because like we fell into like a fight we've been having on and off. It was an argument that we had when we first met, an intellectual argument that gets heated because we're on very different sides of it. And so we just fell. It was just an old behavior, and we saw. I mean, you know, so we were laughing at ourselves for like picking this up again. But then again, you know, it's got emotion, and we weren't smart enough to catch it in time. Nice Frida Kahlo mug.
One of my heroes.
Cool lady. Uh, yeah, so we didn't catch it in time, and once it got started, yeah, we had to sort of like walk it through, and I think we actually, it was useful because we hadn't, as I said, we don't fight that often. Like we hadn't done this in a while. And we actually, I think, took the fight from a fight into a discussion into, okay, like this is where we are on it. It's not as far apart as one another. So like that was, you know, and by the way, that doesn't happen all the time, because to sit down and have like a 3-hour fight, you know what I mean? That like, I don't have that kind of time. My wife doesn't have that kind of time. We don't, that's a sort of a luxury, right? But useful now. And you know, what I was proud of us for was we were like smart enough to not to go to bed pissed, kind of thing. Like you don't, right? Like this is a really incredibly stressful time. And as you know, you have no idea what you're going to wake up to in the morning, at all. And you don't want to like, I don't want to carry any more emotional weight around than I absolutely have to right now, because everything weighs a lot.
Yeah, yeah. No, thanks. Relationship advice in the age of Corona, I think is
And by the way, I have to tell you, like, do not ever, I know about relationships. I try to stay in my lane. So this is not relationship advice. This is Steven and his wife fumbling along like everybody else.
well, it's valuable. And what you said about having 3 hours to actually digest and process together, you don't get that day to day. And so actually, I think while divorce rates might spike after this, it's kind of like Burning Man. It's like it'll either deepen or destroy your love. Like one of these experiences will either make you fall deeper in love with that person because you've been bonded by this chaos, or you'll suddenly get to see sides of them that you never did. What do you think this 3-week period says about America as a nation, about who we are?
So I know you like these broad questions.
Yeah.
Uh, I try to stay in my lane. I don't do culture. I really don't. I'll tell you a story. I did an event with Dr. Daniel Kahneman. We were both on stage, and I was sort of hosting him through an evening of discussion. And at the end of our conversation on like cognitive biases and flow, it was a very heavyweight room, like a really crazy room with lots of like, it was Dr. Kahneman, right? Like Nobel laureate on stage, lots of heavyweights in the audience. And this woman gets up, and she clearly doesn't know who he is. And she clearly just heard psychologist, and tells him this awful, terrible story about her brother who was tortured and blown up and has PTSD and blah. It's terrible. And I'm about to like step in, because I was like, you know what I mean? Like somebody's got to take the hit. And she finishes, and there's like just dead silence in the room. And he looks, and he goes, "Lady, I'm not that kind of psychologist. I try to stay in my lane." And, you know, it's hard to resist swinging at a pitch like that. And it was so much intellectual humility to kind of figure, if a guy like Daniel Kahneman can do it, I should probably too. There are things I have deep expertise about, happy to talk about those. But when it comes to, I'm just another guy with an opinion at that point.
Totally. No, and that makes sense. And I'm glad that you brought that up because I have a lot of questions about the things that you are a deep expert in. And so for those that don't know you, how would you define your
What I do.
life's mission? Yeah, like what you do. And why does it matter?
So I think like all of us, your life's mission evolves and you're not quite sure what the hell you were doing until after the fact. The novelist and huge hero of mine, William Gibson, this cyberpunk writer, once said, I fucking love going out on book tour because I get to talk to all these people and they get to tell me what I've been up to these past 5 years.
So it's the
And
perception of him.
It's very hard, I think, when you're in things, even when writing a book, to even know what you're writing about. You think you're writing one thing, and when it goes out in the world, people come up to you and they tell you what you actually wrote, and you're like, oh yeah, I see that, but I did not, that's not what I was writing, but I totally see how you see that. But the answer to your question, I don't mean to dodge your question, but the answer to your question is, I think what I've done is spent my entire life studying those moments in time when the impossible becomes possible. And I've done this in every domain imaginable. I started out in culture and action sports. So like looking at the arts and music and, painting and theater and movies, and simultaneously in sports. And I've got a science background. So like that was always the lens that I brought to it. And, I quickly took this into technology, in the early 90s. I helped start one of the first online magazines. I was involved in a startup that was the first company to try to put biofeedback into a computer game so you could play the game, but physiologically. I was in and around San Francisco, so you fall into those kinds of projects back then. So I was in the tech space, and I started to realize that, holy crap, all these sci-fi technologies are about to start becoming real. So I made a list of 30 or 40 sci-fi technologies, and I tracked them. And every time one became real, 9 times out of 10, I was in the room or covering the story. So I tracked in time, though, all those, every domain imaginable, when does the impossible become possible? And the why question, history is sort of littered with the impossible becoming possible. It's sort of everywhere. We do this all the time, and yet we still use words like impossible all the time. And I got really curious. So I really started making a study of that. And then this leads into the two sides of my career. Whenever you see the impossible become possible, whenever is a big statement, 90% of the time, 85% of the time, when you see the impossible become possible, you usually see the intersection of two things. You see people finding ways to extend and expand human capability. So that's all the work I do in neuroscience and neurobiology and on flow. And then you also see people harnessing disruptive technology, which is all the work I've done with Peter Diamandis and Singularity University and Abundance, Bold, Tomorrowland, even Futures Faster Than You Think, that side. And at the Flow Research Collective, where we both study the neurobiology of peak performance and use what we learn to train people. Obviously, those two things come together. I mean, we work with some of the very disruptive technologies that I write about, AI and some of the neural brain imaging stuff, et cetera, sensors, networks, computers, and we're using that to decode peak performance and to train it up in the world. So they sort of have come together again. But why have I done it? Like so everybody, when they ask a big why, they usually want some kind of purpose, mission statement thing. And I always tell people this, my mission, if you want like that thing, is to make the world a better place for animals. That's always like, that's an old, I've been fighting that fight for a long time. My wife and I ran an animal sanctuary. I helped start a bunch of different organizations. I've been an environmental journalist for 30 years at this point. So that's my cause. If people are, I do believe that if we're going to solve our grand challenges, it's people harnessing, accelerating exponential technology in flow, working together like never before. I do think that's part of the thing. But on the flow side, I'm in it for the research. I'm in it for the why. I'm not in it for the people. I wanted more flow for myself and my friends and the folks who were getting busy and going after these big problems. Yeah, absolutely. But as far as, it's not that I didn't like other people, or I don't care. I want to make the world a better place for animals. That's a mission to me. Flow is very personal. I'm obsessed with decoding how this state works in the, and using that information to be able to build the best training in the world. What happens in the world with this stuff, I'm interested in the feedback because I want to get it right. I'm less interested in where it goes. I'm glad it goes. And I think, in a sense, I think I'm probably the person who's best in the world suited to do that particular job. And I think it's a public good, but it's not necessary. And because it's a public good, I'll do it. You know, and a chunk of your life should be service, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
And that means you do things you don't necessarily like. And so does any of that make any sense?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And I appreciate the candor and transparency. I think, when I was reading West of Jesus, it was so clear that flow was the thing that saved your life. And so there was this kind of natural curiosity of, how much further can we take this? And I think, in the hands of someone like you, who is as curious and as well researched with kind of the science background, you've taken flow to levels that it could have never been taken. And so what people do with that is on them. And that's the gift that's kind of out of your hands. I really want to acknowledge the work that you do with animals. The Rancho de Chihuahua Animal Sanctuary is one of the kindest things that I think a human being can do. Given that right now we're in this state of chaos, and when I think about kind of the 22 different flow triggers, there's psychological, creative, social, and I forgot the last one. Environmental.
And by the way, so those were the categories that I put triggers in when I wrote Rise of Superman.
Yep.
The science is a bunch, and I've renamed those categories a little bit, more trying to base, like, what we've managed to start to do is decode how the triggers work neurobiologically, and that's starting to change how they cluster and things like that. So I think those categories are really useful because they're easy and everybody can sort of wrap their heads around them. So I'll talk about them that way because if you can do it, it totally makes sense to people. Though I'm not, they're a little wobbly is all I want to say. There's I think probably better ways. And as we get more and more into trigger neuroscience over the next 2 to 3 years, I think that'll totally shift. But so the environmental triggers, we now think of them as internal triggers and external triggers. Okay. And even that isn't exactly right because some of them straddle both.
Okay. So taking all categories away, given the amount of unprecedented stress and anxiety that people are in, right, for millions of people around the world, in America especially, we're seeing this, is they're being thrown into the work from home ocean overnight. The compound stress of what's going on in the world, the media onslaught, having kids that they have to homeschool or deal with, being with a partner 24/7, or if people are single, they're dealing with deep, deep loneliness and isolation. So every single person is going through their own unique battle right now. What are the flow triggers that during this unprecedented time are kind of like the go-to?
So it's a good question, and I'm going to back it up once because there's a couple things. First of all, there's a couple things, reframing things that I think are useful to understand about the human brain. And second of all, the way I've been approached, I think there's like 6 things that has come out of positive psychology. I call them the positive psychology basics. 3 are sort of on the energy body side of the equation, and 3 are on the mental side of the equation. And those are foundational. And normally, under normal circumstances, you can sort of skip some of those things, right? You don't need them all. Now you need them all. And you need them all before you can even start to access flow. And the reason is fear can block flow. the neurobiology of fear, cortisol and specifically norepinephrine will block flow. So you have to, before you can even start playing with the flow triggers, you got to calm your nervous system down. But let me back it up one step and just talk about where the fear is coming from. And we have a number of different ongoing problems. The first is that COVID-19 is a pandemic, and it's real, and it's devastating lives and economies, and it's scary and all that stuff, and that is certainly going on. On top of it, we have a problem with our brain dealing with exponential. So the brain evolved in an era that was local and linear. Everything we dealt with was a day, 2 days walk away. Linear, the rate of progression was really slow, right? Nothing changed between your great-great-grandfather's life and his great-great-grandson's life. Today, we're in a world that's global and exponential, and the human brain did not evolve to process change at that speed or that scale. And this is one of the reasons flow as a training is so effective, because it massively amplifies kind of all stages of information processing in the brain. But so you can sort of keep up with exponentials in flow, but psychologists talk about a linear bias. We literally cannot perceive exponential change. A virus, by definition, is exponential, right? That's what it does. It grows exponentially. Really, every time you flip on your computer and you look at one of those growth maps of the virus, it's massively terrifying. It's horrific, right? I would, by the way, easy way to calm down is pull up some growth map for the flu on an average year. Like, I know this is a lot worse and whatever, but like, you can also, it also does the same thing that we're seeing, same things with colds as they move around. That's just how exponentials work. And you can sort of expose yourself to them a little bit and the brain calms down. But as a general rule, when we perceive exponential growth, it short circuits the brain. The brain goes, I don't know what this is. And uncertainty plus anxiety, that's fear. And so our reaction to seeing exponential growth in the world is fear and anxiety. Worse, brain evolved in an era of immediacy, right? Threats were the tiger in the bush variety. And you're either going to fight back right now or you're going to flee right now. And the danger, like you get eaten by the tiger, you get away. And that's the threat level we evolved to deal with. We are up against a probabilistic danger. The economy might nosedive. This might go global and overwhelm all of our hospitals, right? Those are probabilistic things. The brain can't shut off until a danger is gone completely, because that's what it evolved to do. Probabilistic dangers are not gone completely, and they are very tricky. And what they do is they make us hyper vigilant. And so that's a massive uptick in fear. So you've got the exponential problem coupled with the probabilistic danger problem, and you put them two together, and you're going to be terrified. Just forget everything. Forget the reality of the problem. Forget all the outcomes that you were talking about, whether it's loneliness or being stuck with somebody you don't like or whatever. Take your pick. There's all that. But there's also the fact that our brain literally can't do this. So a certain portion of what we're up against is literally, it's just hardwiring that was not built for this particular thing, which is why I think the 6 positive psychology tools, I could talk about it for half a second, are so important. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's almost like the precursor to anything is you've got to have this foundation down. So please tell us what they are.
So before I even get there, the one thing that is really important to you, do you know the term locus of control?
I do know the term locus of control.
Right. It means you feel like if you have an internal locus of control, I control my life. I'm in charge of my destiny, right? Sort of what Carol Dweck meant by mindset to growth versus fixed. Locus of control is, I think, the slightly more technical, better term. And people who have an external locus of control, they think life happens to them. The world happens to them. What we know about peak performance across the boards is you can't even get into the ring if you have an external locus of control. If you think life happens to you, you don't have agency. One of the reasons the free will discussion in science, which can often seem like a lot of nasal gazing from the outside, is so important, is because of this issue. If we don't have free will, right, as there are various theory of mind philosophers who occasionally like to argue, then we give up our locus of control, and then peak performance sort of goes out the window. And so that's another problem with an exponential threat, is it feels like it's happening to us. So you have to take back agency in some way. And often that's nothing more than like small creative tasks, right? Like it's a really great way to sort of take back some agency. But anyways, the peak performance basics are, on the energy side, they're obvious. It's sleep. We need 7 to 8 hours of sleep a night. Hydration, nutrition. I'm not going to go into hydration, nutrition, because I'm not an expert in either of those things, and it's obvious what I mean. The third one is social support. And I put this in the energy side of the equation. It could also be a cognitive problem, but we are so hardwired. Like Chris Peterson, who's a positive psychologist at the University of Michigan, has said you can sum up 30 years of positive psychology in the phrase "other people matter." And right, that's what. I did an event last night with neuroscientist Glenn Fox. This exact same. He studies gratitude. And he made this exact same point. He's like, that it's so foundational in social psychology. So I want to point out, we're practicing physical distancing. We're not practicing social distancing. So now as you pointed out, this is when you want to double down. You really do need to call friends and, talk to people, FaceTime, whatever you want to do. You need that right now, both because it will give you more energy. And you have to just think about this at a really simple level. So information comes into the brain, and it goes to the thalamus, which is sort of the gating. It's the big filter. And the thalamus says, oh, your visual information, you go here, and you're this, and you're that. It throws it around the brain. And then it goes two places. It goes to the amygdala, which is going to tell you, is there something new? It's threat detection. And simultaneously, it goes up to the medial, or it goes up to the orbital prefrontal cortex, like right sort of back behind your nose. And that is a part of your brain that does, it does risk assessment, but it's based on social support. So the first thing the brain does is it wants to analyze, hey, if you have a problem, ViKA, and you have to solve it by yourself, and it's a hard problem, you're screwed. But if you've got 30 of your friends to help you, well, you're safe, right? So in every situation, the brain does this very fast calculation of, oh, you're facing a danger. How big is your network? How robust are your connections? And it helps evaluate the threat level. So you want to double down right now on social support. It will, it'll calm you down, and it'll also give you more energy. So that's the obvious energy physiology side of this equation. The other side is equally obvious stuff we all know how to do: gratitude lists, mindfulness, and exercise, right? Research shows 5 minutes of gratitude practice, 11 to 20 minutes of mindfulness respiration is what you need for the cognitive emotional benefits, and 20 to 40 minutes of exercise, or exercising until it gets quiet upstairs, right? This is not about physical benefits, right? Whatever your exercise routine for that is. I'm just talking about if you want the psychological. And normally when we do this work, we say, look, on an energy side, you can screw one of those up a day, right? You can get enough sleep if your hydration, nutrition, and your social support is if you got it nailed, right? Or if you got in a fight with your wife or your girlfriend or your boyfriend or whatever, so your social support is sort of screwed up. If you got enough sleep and you really take care of hydration, nutrition, you're probably going to be able to function okay. Under these circumstances, no, you need all three, right? You can't waver. And with gratitude, mindfulness, and exercise, I think it's the same thing. Under normal conditions, I tell people, pick one a day. If you don't have any time, grab for gratitude. You've got a little more time, go for mindfulness, exercise, or some combination thereof. And now I think you have to go for all three. I've been using all three every day, right? I've been making sure I'm getting as much sleep as I possibly, I'm really taking care of all that stuff. And then when it comes to flow, I don't even think, so let's talk about why flow matters in this phase of this, and why I think there's a better way to approach it than the flow triggers right now. Though those can be important, and we can talk about them in a second. But flow is critical here for three reasons. If you don't know if flow is an optimal state of performance where we feel our best, we perform our best, the uptick in performance is massive. Depending on all these are various studies that have been done. McKinsey found that productivity goes up and motivation goes up 500% in flow for top executives. The Department of Defense found we learn 240% faster in flow. Other people have pushed that up to 500% under certain conditions. Creativity, this is work we've done. Work done at the University of Sydney in Australia, worked on at Harvard, shows creativity will spike 400 to 700%. Empathy, environmental awareness, creativity, cooperation. There's a long list of things that spike. It's a big push. And that's why most people want flow. But there are two other properties that really matter now, which is when we move into flow, all the stress hormones are flushed out of our system. So cortisol, norepinephrine, all that stuff gets flushed. It resets the nervous system. Simultaneously, there's 5 or 6, way more, but 5 or 6 main neurochemicals that show up in flow. All of them are immune system boosters. So they're really, really good for the immune system. So you've got a cocktail that resets the nervous system, boosts resilience, and massively amplifies performance. So you really want this cocktail right now. As I said before, too much fear and we'll block it. And that's the trigger we should probably talk about. But the first thing I want to say is all of us have a primary flow activity. Usually we have primary and secondary flow activities. So for me, a primary flow activity is skiing. I go skiing. I've been skiing since I was 4. 90% of the time, it's a flow state. It's almost guaranteed. I love it. Writing, which I've also been doing since I was 5, is about 70% of the time. So that's my secondary. It's very rare for somebody, if you can avoid it, you don't really want to work in your primary flow activity unless you really love the work. Secondary, right? Because like if I tried to teach a flow and skiing course once with Kristen Ulmer, and I was so pissed. I was like, who the fuck are these people ruining my ski day? Get out. I didn't want to teach anybody anything. I was so mad. I was like, okay, this is why you don't do that, right? So anyways, if you don't know what your primary flow activity is, flow amplifies memory. So just think back over your life. What were my favorite activities these past 5 years? You'll get images of flow because we tend to remember all the bad and flow, right? Those are and then, love and a couple other your wedding and like those kinds of things, but we tend to remember flow. So now is the time to, among other things, to double down on your primary flow activity. And you gotta, like, I'm not going skiing because first of all, they've shut down the lifts and I don't want to go to a hospital right now. Hospitals are overwhelmed, right? They don't need me with a broken leg. So I'm going and doing really mellow stuff. A couple of weeks ago, we got some snow around my house and I built a micro jump in my backyard and was teaching myself nose butter 360s at, age 53, which is pretty amusing because I'm actually secretly 10, but that's besides the point.
Is that a byproduct of flow state too?
It's definitely a byproduct of flow.
Reverse aging.
Or just general immaturity in the face of life. But I will say that, a lot of us are stuck inside and we can't access our primary flow activity. Figure it out, right? Like hip hop dance classes are available for free online. Take them. You know what I mean? Like rediscover something that gave you, because you can use the flow triggers. We all obviously have to double down on our work and do that stuff, but you need kind of like a reboot to your nervous system, especially if you've been running really hot. Mm-hmm. Flow will, if you've been hyper vigilant, you really got to break that state. You can sort of do it with exercise, gratitude, and mindfulness, but it's going to take 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 days. You know what I mean? Those are effective tools, and they work over time. Right? They're good interventions on a daily basis, but none of them are huge firework interventions. Dan Harris wasn't wrong. They produce 5-10% differences in somebody's life. And that's, by the way, is under really good conditions. Yeah. Those are right. That's under really, really good conditions. Under rougher conditions, you got to really lean in. You got to do an hour of meditation or 2 hour of meditation. And it is really freaking hard to sit still that long if you're hypervigilant and scared to death, because norepinephrine literally makes you want to move. That's that feeling inside you, agitation. How do you stop being agitated? You move, literally. Forward motion calms the brain down. So we can't, like, it literally relaxes fear. We're less afraid when we're moving towards things.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, and this is what I've been experiencing too, is that I literally need to like feel my body sweat. I need a state of like intense visceral embodiment, like sprinting to the ocean and just getting out of the micro flow, which is kind of like watching a movie or meditation, and going to the macro flow, which in day-to-day world would be extreme sports, but it's like you got to create your own version of extreme sports. Is that right? If we
well,
want to
it's not even, I mean, extreme sports, I mean, you want to, so creativity is a really great tool to reach for here. And if you're an action sport athlete, especially, and you can't do your action sport, what you're missing is dopamine, which you get from novelty, complexity, unpredictability, and risk. But you also get it from creativity, from pattern recognition, from linking ideas together. So now is, I'll give you, for my own life, like I'm writing every day, but I have a way long time ago, I have a minor in fine art, and I like to draw. I'm not very good at it, but I do like to draw. I like to draw, you know, like I tend to draw out of comic books and other like cool sci-fi comic books. And I'll just read copy comic books. So I've been doing that a lot lately, just because it gives me, when the drawings start to click, there's little pattern recognition and there's a little more novelty there because I'm not used to doing it. So I've been reaching for other things. You know, we always do this when we work with like Navy SEALs who are retiring, or when we work with professional athletes who are stopping being professional athletes. The ones who succeed in where they go next are often the ones who combine some kind of baseline mindfulness, those kind of toolkits, with something very creative. Going into filmmaking, you see a lot of transitions from action sport athlete into photography or into filmmaking. Those people tend to do very well. You see action sport athletes start clothing lines, or skateboard companies where they're designing things. That creativity, it's dopamine. So it's the same. You can't, like, it's not all at once. Like when you jump off a cliff, you get a shit ton of dopamine, right? If you combine novelty and complexity together, or unpredictability, this is Robert Sapolsky's work out of Stanford, it's not mine, but there's a 500 to 700% spike in dopamine. Cocaine is 700%. So like novelty and complexity is almost getting you to cocaine levels of dopamine in your body. So, you know, what I would say is maybe run to the ocean, or maybe just take a sketchbook out to the novel environment of the ocean, right? Like combine those kinds of things. But I also hear you. There's a mountain behind my house, and there's 4 tiers to it. And usually it takes, if I want to get to the top of the 4th tier, it's like an hour and 45-minute hike, and maybe a little under it, maybe like an hour and a half. And I've been like sprinting the dogs up it. You just like, whoa. It's not, there's no rock climbing, there's no nothing. It's just, it's just like hiking up a big hill. But I've been going really, really, really fast and trying to shrink my loops. And I've been doing it because I want to totally exhaust my brain. I just want to shut it down, right? And then I've also been running back downhill, which is totally dumb and will put me in the hospital, but I like running down mountains.
Let's keep you out of the hospital. But to your point, I do think that this is the greatest creative renaissance of our time. This is an epoch-defining moment. And when we look back on the year, because I think this will be probably at 12 to 18 months, some of the greatest pieces of art will emerge out of this. Books, paintings, I know I've started also drawing for myself. And if a month ago someone told us, hey, the whole world is going to be on pause and you're finally going to have time to start that podcast, write that book, start drawing, we'd think they were crazy. But the truth is that this is the new now.
There's an Orson Welles movie, and I'm going to screw this quote up, but it's awesome. He's talking about the Renaissance, and he's like, the Borgias were running it. You had 500 years of, rape, murder, mayhem, craziness. And what did we get? Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, blah, blah. And the line is, and in Switzerland, they've had 500 years of eternal peace. And what did it produce? The cuckoo clock. I'm sorry to all my Swiss friends. It's just a funny line, but yeah, we are, you get great art out of great strife for sure. And I always say that I think I have a career because I learned to turn fear into words.
Mm.
And that's I really, I mean, if you talk to my best friend about my career, my business, my whatever, he will call it the empire that fear built. For sure. Like, I started out as a crazy neurotic Jew, which is what I am. And it took a really, and went into, like, by the way, if you're crazy and neurotic, and especially like worried about money, and then decide to become a freelance writer, you're out of your freaking mind.
That's a terrible idea.
Terrible idea. It's a terrible idea. But I wasn't good at anything else. Like, I couldn't get a job. I had long dreadlocks. Nobody would hire me. This was back in the late.
Was this
80s.
post India?
I have never been to India.
Oh, I thought you went backpacking.
I've backpacked all over Asia, but I've never been to India.
Gotcha. Okay.
And I
So
wasn't, I've never gone anywhere as a backpacker. I've gone everywhere as a journalist.
Okay. So you were able to do the thing that we're talking about, which is take a tremendous amount of fear and anxiety and uncertainty and become one of the busiest and most successful writers.
I'll tell you, honest God. So I came out of college, and my senior thesis was an epic poem. I was a poet. I was trained as a poet. And as I was writing this epic poem, I realized it was 110 pages long, I think. I realized halfway through, I was like, this is a novel. Like, the reason the poem isn't working so well is because this is a book. And I had never, I didn't even know how to write fiction. I didn't, if that wasn't the thing I did. And I knew I had to start it and rewrite. I ended up rewriting that book. It took 11 years to write my first book, and I ended up rewriting it from scratch like 4 different times. But I had to start somewhere. And I remember I was heartbroken over a woman, and I remember being like in my room, and I was like, you can either sit here and mope, or you can take all this energy and try to use it to start this fucking book, and maybe it'll feel better. Right. There was just I didn't think anything was going to feel better. Remember what it's like to be heartbroken at 22. It's a lot of heartbreak.
Yeah.
And maybe you are still 22. So maybe
33.
Okay. That does. Sorry. I didn't know. I can't tell how old anybody is these days. So it worked then. Right. So every time afterwards, I was like, oh, I just take all this crap and I turn it into this. And somehow it tends to make me feel better. And it looks like I can make a living from this. And I sure got a lot of that. So it was a good trade. It worked really well.
Yeah. As a fellow neurotic Jew who went into the unknown world of creative arts, I feel you.
Right.
Yeah. And I think it also takes a delusional level of self-belief. And I think that's actually what is being asked of us is there's a huge shift happening in the world. 1 in 12 Americans is unemployed. So there's going to be a massive pivot of how do you take your old career and your creative genius and convert it into something that gives you purpose and gives you a paycheck.
It's funny because Bold, which was the book Peter and I wrote before The Future is Faster Than You Think, really talks about this very thing. Like, how do you digitize your business to keep pace with exponential technology is a question we really looked at. And how do you use flow to augment that as well is a question we looked at in Bold. And it's, we're going to get, what I'm interested and excited about is, first of all, that allows for a lot more flexibility and adaptability. We're going to get very anti-fragile businesses on the back end of this, right? Which is really interesting. And we're going to get very creative businesses that are really, really interesting. And it's not often the whole world is given the shot to sort of reinvent itself, right? The last time, this is a comment I will make, which is, I think when 9/11 happened, that was another opportunity for the nation to reinvent itself. And we chose not to. Whether or not those were the right decisions, as I said, I try to stay in my lane, but we sort of reacted and did what we have tended to do as a country in the face of something like that. And maybe it was the best reaction. Maybe it wasn't. As I said, I'm really not qualified to make that comment, but I am hoping this time we do something different. Yeah, my best friend, who's also my editor, always says, I just want to make different mistakes. Right? Like I've made those mistakes. Now let me make different mistakes. Why make the same old mistakes?
Yeah. I agree with it. And when I was reading The Future is Faster Than We Think, economist Joseph Chumter was talking in the migration chapter about creative destruction. And so my question was, what do you think COVID will destroy to create?
So let's talk a little bit about some stuff that I don't think most people are talking about with COVID, and I don't know why. So I think there's 2 points here that I think are your answer, or as best as I can offer. One is, I think there's 3 pandemics. There's COVID-19, which is the first pandemic. There is the pandemic of fear that we've been sort of talking about all day and how to cure. But there is a third pandemic that's maybe the most amazing thing I've ever seen, and it's the pandemic of cooperation. That's the antidote to the first 2 pandemics, right? We are fighting against the pandemic of fear and the pandemic of COVID-19 with cooperation. And Harvard geneticist David Sinclair said earlier this week in an interview, he said this is the first time in the million-year history of our species that we've been united against a common enemy, which is absolutely true. And, I can give you examples. Like, this is the first time in history, we are literally staying home and going without. 1 out of 12 of us does not have a job to protect the old and the sick and the weak. Holy crap. In cities, I've talked to people across the globe, every neighborhood in the world, there are signs that say, hey, need help, need medicine, need food, text this number. We're here to help. We're your neighbors. That's amazing. And that's global. And on the scientific and technology front, what we're seeing is unlike anything we've ever seen. There are 100 million to 200 million scientists, doctors, nurses, healthcare professionals, etc. And this does not include the technologists and the entrepreneurs pointed directly at the same problem. And there are now, I think this may be out of date because I just saw something else approved, but 42 different vaccines and cures have entered clinical trials. There were none 2.5 weeks ago, right? So that like nothing like that has ever happened. There's a global hackathon to, for example, 3D print medical supplies. We've got Italy figured out, teams in Italy figured out how to use 3D print respirator valves. Then a partnership between Airbus, HP, and like 11 other companies that have nothing to do with each other, except they all have industrial sized 3D printers, figured out how to print ventilators. And now they're trying to figure out how do you do it at scale. 12 different companies have figured out how to 3D print masks. My friend Scott Summit, who's a 3D print designer, who normally works on prosthetic limbs, figured out how do you produce a face mask from a Pepsi bottle and solved it, right? And this is, my favorite is Winsun, which is the Chinese company. We wrote about them in Abundance and Bold and touched on them in Faster, so the name may be familiar to you. They got famous because they could 3D print single-family homes in a day, and then they did an apartment complex over a weekend. They are 3D printing quarantine rooms and hospitals in record time. The day after there was no deaths in China, I think it was them, it might have been a different company with the same technology. They 3D printed essentially an Amazon Go grocery store, so no cashiers. They stocked the entire thing, robot stockers, right? All use sensors in it. So like no contact, 6 feet away. You don't have to touch anybody. You don't have to talk to anybody. Automatic ticket. And they put it up in 24 hours. And you Google it, you can see the photo of it. It's a huge grocery store. So, we wrote a book called The Future is Faster Than You Think. And it turns out the future is faster than we thought.
Yeah.
Right? We thought, the book looks at how exponential technology and how converging exponential. So what happens when robotics meets AI meets sensors, right, in one collision, and you always get a whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And what we had said, and this is based on Ray Kurzweil's numbers, that we're going to experience over the next 10 years, 100 years worth of technological change. So think back to 1920, go to now, put it into 10 years. And what I think has happened is we're going to see it in 3 to 4. It's, I mean, like we have stepped on the gas. And that brings me to my final point about this, which is one of the reasons I'm optimistic. And one of the reasons I think for certain that we're going to be dealing with this for 18 months. And certainly lives are being scarred and changed, and the repercussions for that will last a very long time. That said, this is the first time in history we are fighting an exponential threat with exponential technology. And what we're all seeing now is the threat side. Oh my God, it's exploding. We can't stop it. And what you don't realize is that the solutions are actually on the same growth curve. They're a little, right? They're lagging behind, but like from 0 vaccines and cures that normally take years, if not decades to come up with, to 42 of them in 3 weeks' time. We are fighting an exponential problem with exponential solutions, and we've never done that before. So I like our chances, is my point.
That is a narrative that I really want to promote. Thank you for saying that. I also think that the vaccines that are, or the testing kits that are happening right now went from taking several days to now it's a pinprick in 15 minutes. So
I just saw, there's a faster test that I just saw that will tell you if you've ever had it at all. And it's another, I think it's a pinprick as well, that just I popped up this morning. I haven't even had time to go back and look at it and figure out, is this bullshit science or is it real? So I could be lying here, but that was another one. And the testing side. And the other thing that is worth pointing out is, in a weird way, we probably will not be having this particular problem 10 years from now. We may not even be having it 5 years from now. And especially because of the acceleration that happens. If you look at the COVID problem as a problem, you have a diagnostic problem on the left, you have a treatment problem in the middle, and then you have a prevention, drug cure problem on the end. And what we're seeing right now is a complete reinvention of every aspect of the medical treatment train. We already have biosniffers that can find pathogens in the air and bacteria and find anything harmful. These connected to diagnostic AIs in the cloud that can sequence the DNA, sequence the RNA. All this is real. Like, this is here right now. It's just not quite at scale. We've got all kinds of medical sensors that can plug into your smartphone on the front end and measure almost anything. And on the back end, we've got AIs and CRISPR and things like that, sequencing and altering faster than ever before. And the final stage is the testing phase, right? Which is where the real slowdown is, or one of the slowdowns. And we are getting better and better and better at simulating all of human biology. And depending on who's not want to go by, that capability comes online this decade. Definitely is enabled by quantum computing, which I don't think is, we write about it, but it's not totally here for prime time. The error rate is still way too high in quantum computing, but it's going down very, very quickly. And it's really good for this particular project, but AI is almost good enough. And on the testing side, by the way, on the front end, the other roadblock, we have external sensors. I could plug them into my smartphone. I could turn it into a thermometer. I could, all that stuff already exists. Next generation, I would have said a month ago that by the time they get into your smartphone, it's going to be 3 years from now, maybe 5. I think it's going to be next year. I think every single smartphone maker in the world is now gone, okay, what's the thermometer plug-in? What's what biosensors can I put in this? How do we prevent this kind of testing problem ever happening again? So would it work if we've got something like, aerosolized Ebola that is 80% virulent and can kill us so fast? I don't know. We're not, at some point, yeah, we may get fast enough for that, but for something like COVID, this is a problem that we have the opportunity to actually solve or significantly dent this particular problem this decade. I'm not saying climate change or species die off isn't going to kill us next decade, right? Or, something
But it's a great
else.
dress rehearsal. If nothing else, we now understand that the impossible is possible, right? That if this is possible with humans hurting, what is possible when the earth is hurting? And we can't control that. And there's no vaccine for that. So I bring us to the after show portion, which is just going to be the last 5 minutes. And as somebody who has been studying the power of curiosity and really trying to bring that back to life as a life philosophy, because Krishnamurti, one of my favorite philosophers, says that the highest form of enlightenment is observation. And if we simply took more time to observe, the precursor to observation is attention. The precursor to attention is curiosity. So what are you curious about, Steven?
I think the actual probably better question for me is, what am I not curious about? Opera. And I could be swayed, right? Like you could start to talk to me about the science of how it works and you might get me. Opera, large swatches of country music. And even then, like if I got to know the singer-songwriters, I would probably, get it, I would find a way in. I'm really, I'm not, and the stock market, like I think it's legalized gambling and people are betting on other people's dreams. And I'm not comfortable with that. I think that there's a great capital engine of capitalism that I'm really for. I just don't like the way it currently works. I don't think you should be able to bet on other people's dreams in that way. I think you should be able to support it, but I like not when you start short selling, and doing stuff where you're just playing games with money and you're fucking with lives in that way just for dollars. I don't get. That's a level of greed I just don't understand. I'd go blank. So maybe, but once again, by the way, I could be swayed, right? Give me the right data scientist and right. So I really don't know anything I'm not curious about. Where my focus is right now is, and what I'm most curious about is I'm working with Dr. Andrew Huberman at Stanford on trying to decode what happens in the first 2 seconds of flow in the brain. So right at the front end of the flow state, what happens? We're looking really hard at that. I think that's really interesting. Simultaneously, we're building a biophysical-based flow detector that can measure flow in the body and the brain rather than having to use a psychological questionnaire. Those things I'm really excited about those things. And really like that work. So I'm curious about everything. Like you, I completely agree with you. Curiosity, it's the foundational ingredient in passion, in purpose, in attention, as you mentioned. In fact, I have a book coming out on peak performance, everything I've ever learned about peak performance next year, called The Art of Impossible. And it essentially opens on curiosity as the foundational motivator that you have to learn how to harness first. And so I'm a huge fan. And like the secret to being a freelance writer is always to exploit your curiosity. And I was very, very lucky, right? I found a way to get paid to be curious. Are you kidding? Like my favorite room is the room where I'm the dumbest guy in the room and could ask questions, right? Like I found a way to get paid to be the dumbest guy in the room. And yes, I have been yelled at by several Nobel laureates. I mean, loudly, like they got really mad because my questions were so dumb, but like, okay, fair enough.
So on that topic, what is the question that ruminates inside your mind most often?
Jesus. I mean, I have an answer that I usually give, and you have to understand that when I say this, I do not mean this in a woo-woo spiritual anything kind of way. I mean this in a neurobiological kind of way. But the question that I'm most interested in is in flow, a lot of other states, but flow, it's really apparent. You have access to levels of information you don't have under normal conditions. We process information faster, we take in things faster, but there always seems like there's, in deep flow states especially, there's always something that comes up where you're like, the hell did this come from? Like I could explain a lot of this with pattern recognition and heightened attention, all that, but there's always, I always say 90% of flow you could explain, and there's always 10% you can't quite explain yet. And this is not to say that I think there's something metaphysical. I actually think there's something physical that we can't yet measure. But there's definitely still a mystery there. And I've always, and I'll give you a simple example. In West of Jesus, the book you brought up earlier, I tell a story about surfing in Santa Monica, and the wave, it was a fairly big wave, and it started to close out, and I was literally getting flung to the sand below me. And I managed to like land on my board and link together 6 or 7 moves I had never done before. And I had never done any of this stuff. And it just like it happened in a flow state. And I always say, I can explain physiologically why my muscles could move so fast. I can explain a lot of how that happened, but there's still the level of I was executing moves I had never executed before in a sequence I've never done before. And where did that information come from? How did I know? Right? And you can almost explain it and it almost makes sense, but there's a little bit of it where you're like, right? And, or, you know, you've had that experience where I'll be writing and an idea will click in such a way where I'm like, wow, that's a little bit of a bigger insight than I normally, you know what I mean? Like, you're like, I can explain where 80% of that, but 10% of that, like it sort of came out of nowhere. So I think where the information comes from is my answer.
The source, systems thinking. That makes sense for a curious person.
Yep.
As we sign off, I know a lot of people are looking for guidance right now. And in staying in your lane, what is something that you want folks to do more of and less of? I started this experiment where every month I added something and I took something away, and I found it really illuminating.
I think everybody should probably go to theflowresearchcollective.com and do more flow classes. I think more flow classes right now, absolutely more, and less of anybody else's classes. I think that would be my answer.
I can personally attest to the power of flow. So thank you. Steven, this was such a joy. Thank you for making this Friday much better than all the other Fridays before this.
So glad. Thank you, ViKA. I got to jump.
Thank you. Have a good one. Cheers.